just to start off, how come you didn't fall for the official story of 9/11? To have produced those commentaries there in January 2002 means that you had to have been gathering facts and starting to analyze them from practically the very day of the attacks. And you were one of a key early group of Canadians. I'm thinking of Michelle Chosudovsky and John McMurtry as well, who were instrumental in getting the 9/11 Truth Movement up and running. Why, Barrie, were you suspicious of the official account right from the start?
Well, Todd, I thought about this a lot. That is, I've thought a lot about why people become suspicious or skeptical of really any official story, any story, but in particular, of course, 9/11. It's such an extravagant case. And why do some people not? And why do some people hold dearly to official stories like this? And I don't think that there's one simple answer, but partly I think it can be attributable both to one's age, and it can be, see, I'm not saying it is always, but it can be attributable to one's age, and of course one's political orientation. So it happens that I'm what could be called a geezer. I'm an older guy. So that, and I grew up in a household. My father was a was a United Church minister here in Canada. That's the largest Protestant denomination in Canada, and a very progressive one. And my father was left of center, no question. And he believed in Christ being the Prince of Peace. He was very, very much for peace. My father was, although he was a squadron leader in the Royal Canadian Air Force during the Second World War. But the thing is, we knew about the rise of Hitler, and my father actually preached from the pulpit against Hitler in the mid-30s, and he nearly lost his position in a church for doing that. There were so many people who were fooled by Hitler, and especially by the media that supported Hitler, which included Time magazine, for instance, and Reader's Digest. So there was, even in the 30s, if we go back, massive propaganda going on behalf of the worst elements. And when the Reichstag fire happened in 1933, the German parliament burned down. Well, yes. My father and his friends were not fooled by that. Clearly, it was done by Hitler, which has been subsequently proven to the satisfaction of almost all historians. And so I grew up knowing about the Reichstag fire, and I think that was key. And that's why on the day of 9/11, when I was watching television and originally believed what I was seeing, the crawl under the CNN screen, was America at war, America under attack, and so on. I was just looking at some old VHS tapes that I'm cleaning out here, and I taped hours and hours and hours that day. I had 3 machines running because my job was media criticism. And I still have those tapes, and we're going to transfer them to digital. They're still pretty valuable. But anyway, on the morning of 9/11, I was in our living room. My wife was there, and a couple of friends, and I was saying, "Come on, U.S. Air Force, let's get going here. Come on, U.S. Air Force." I was getting, saying where these airliners were flying all over Hell's Half Acre, and the U.S. Air Force was not showing up. And my wife told me, "Calm down, for God's sake, calm down." And I said, so I did get calm. I thought, this is impossible. This can't be happening. It's not possible. And of course, it turned out that in a drama in the air, which went on for almost 2 hours, not a single U.S. jet interceptor turned a wheel until it was too late. So by noon that day, I was telling my friends, this is Reichstag fire 2001. And but I wasn't alone in that. A couple of days later, I was working at Vision TV, and I saw my video editor and one of the floor producers. There were I think 3 or 4 of us, and I said, you guys, you may think I'm crazy, and I want to try this out on you. I mean, you tell me if you think I'm crazy, that's fine. But I said, there's something really fishy about 9/11, and they all said, yeah, that's right. And actually, later on the day of 9/11, I called my son, and I said, do you think there was something fishy about what happened today? He said, yeah, I do. So, actually there was a movement already on the day, for gosh sakes. It's just that it got totally squelched by the massive illusion that the media imposed.
Very interesting. Yeah, that accords with my experience as well. From my perspective, it looked like a grade B Hollywood disaster movie script. It just didn't come across as something real. And then, of course, I didn't know about the Reichstag fire at that time, but I did know about some things in history that helped me remain alert and suspicious. And so that I agree with you that there were doubts on the parts of some of us right from the very beginning. That's very interesting. Yeah, but the stand down was quite remarkable, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, well, of course, the Michael Rupert. I remember when I was doing my Great Conspiracy DVD, and I interviewed Michael Rupert by telephone. It was a fake, like, double ender, if you will. It for a DVD. We couldn't be live, but we were live at the time, and we pretended that it was a news program. We had a news anchor set up and so on that Carpenters made. So that was the format of the DVD. And I said to Michael, and we had the double ender going. I said it was a stand down. He said I wouldn't call it a stand down. He said I'd say that the U.S. Air Force was paralyzed or was neutralized, because stand down implies pretty strongly that pilots, for instance, of warplanes have received orders: do not take off, or do not go to a destination where there's a need for you. And I think there's a good chance that if such an order had been given, that some of the pilots would have disregarded those orders. And that's what Lieutenant Bob Bowman says. So long experience with the U.S. Air Force, 101 missions in Vietnam. Probably most of your listeners know about Bob Bowman. Sure. And he said, there's no way those flyboys would have all acted treasonously and followed orders. And but so what they had to be tricked. They had to be fooled. And that's why there was a lot of confusion about all these war games that were going on. Actually, we thought 3 or 4 war games. There was far more than that. And they were confusingly named Northern Guardian and Guardian Vigilance and Northern Vigilance and so on.
Yeah.
So it was a deliberate effort, and it worked, to confuse the whole of the aviation defense setup.
Well, that's interesting. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I take your point about the precise meaning of the term stand down. Nevertheless, we've got Norman Minetta's testimony about the young officer in the Presidential Emergency Operating Center in the basement of the White House approaching Dick Cheney repeatedly and saying, "Does the order still stand? Does the order still stand?" which has been interpreted widely as a question about a stand-down order, maybe specifically related to the Pentagon.
That's right, Todd, and the very word "stand" appears in that testimony, and I think that particular case would be correctly called a stand-down, as I understand it. But overall, with all the different air bases there are around the United States, especially in the Northeast area, that pilots were sent over the Atlantic to do lazy figure eights and everything, and so it wasn't exactly a stand-up.
Yeah. Very interesting point. An effective stand-down. It worked. It took.
Effectively a stand-down. Absolutely.
Yeah. So now your documentaries, The Great Deception and The Great Conspiracy, I thought were key early documentaries, and they had a big impact, and especially because of their excellence, their high journalistic standards, and their professionalism. And then you followed with your book, The Towers of Deception, on the media cover-up of 9/11 in 2006, and I was very impressed with the book, and I was really impressed with your chapter on Noam Chomsky. You articulated things that I had been thinking and concerned about and confused about, and that I had talked about with friends with similar confusion. And you looked at Chomsky's statements on 9/11, and they didn't jibe with reality, and then that suggested to you it would be useful to look at Chomsky's earlier work on Well, there was the Kennedy assassination, just his earlier political work, and you came up with a pretty powerful critique, and I would love it if you could encapsulate that for our audience.
Well, the thing is that I had long been a fervent admirer of Noam Chomsky for all the reasons that any admirers of his would be, because he was spelling out the actions of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, supporting dictators and worse around the world, and so that's a very valuable thing to do, is to look at that big picture and ask, is this American empire so wonderful after all? And the answer is no, that it's done so much damage, and uncovering to a great extent the corporate and military interests that are served by an empire like that. So, but then I couldn't understand, and I wasn't alone in this, how come Chomsky was so poor on the JFK assassination, which to many of us was very clearly not the work of a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, but had to be a government conspiracy. And of course, there are actually literally thousands of books about this. And yet Chomsky, arguably the greatest progressive or left public intellectual on earth, doggedly held to the lone gunman theory. So that, and I remember saying, it's just bizarre. People say, yeah, I can't understand that. How could that be? So we were all in puzzle mode for years. And I actually interviewed Noam Chomsky before 9/11. I interviewed him, I think, 3 times for my TV show, and he was very good on East Timor and so on. But then, and I just remained in puzzlement. And even after 9/11, I was still befuddled by Chomsky's refusal to look properly at 9/11. And then I came across this book of his called Rethinking Camelot. I've got about 16 of his books. And I read that, and what an eye-opener. For the first time, I saw how dishonest he could be. Bald assertions without sources, and word trickery of the worst kind. Was just marking in the margins all this. Really, it was sad, pathetic, and revealing. And so then I started to see there's a pattern with him that all his life he would not accept that the U.S. Elements of the U.S. government would have been involved in the JFK assassination, or RFK, or MLK, or Malcolm X, or Paul Wellstone, or 9/11, of course. So a complete pattern there. Now, since he's so knowledgeable, and this applies, by the way, to all the left gatekeepers, like Alexander Coburn and Amy Goodman, and on. When you have a person who is avowedly and provably progressive or left-wing, shall we say, and who is well-informed and is obviously intelligent and has access to a lot of evidence on any of these things, these assassinations or 9/11, and who persists in denying this evidence, and also who goes on to attack, to ignore or belittle or attack those who point out the evidence, then you're not looking, in my opinion, at an authentic person. You're looking at somebody who's inauthentic. And I would sort of distinguish between an information agent, which implies somebody who's paid by the likes of the CIA to spread disinformation and all the other dirty tricks they engage in, and an agent of disinformation, slight change in wording, which could be somebody who accidentally is passing on disinformation. And of course, we all do it. I mean, I've done it myself. I've believed things that weren't true, and I repeated them thinking they're true, and I became an agent of disinformation. But I think with the likes of Chomsky, and I really couldn't write this in the book, although almost everybody read between the lines and saw that, in fact, I was saying he's a disinformation agent. And typically, they're recruited very, very young. They're recruited out of college or even high school by the CIA. They spot the talent, and then these agents become long-term agents. I'm sorry to say all this, but we have to be more realistic about, shall we say, agentry. There was that marvelous 3-part series in the Washington Post in July of last year called Top Secret America. It's well worth going to that website, and William Arkin was one of the co-authors, and there are 856,000 Americans with top secret clearance, and they work out of 10,000 locations, and so these people are all doing undercover secret work, and it's a huge problem.
Well, I'm glad you're willing to talk about this at the level of specificity that's necessary to make any progress with the topic, because after reading your chapter, I did read between the lines, and I did think for the first time about Chomsky in these terms. I had problems with his Kennedy assassination, nonsense as well. But I think what you're saying is very plausible, and it just raises some questions. For example, if the agents are recruited so early, it suggests that the plans, the events that are taking place have been planned long ahead. They need to have agents in place with high levels of credibility for the time in the future when certain key things are going to happen, so that those agents then can be of service to the perpetrators of these attacks. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
So it suggests that the time frames that the perpetrators, the planners of these false flag operations and endless wars, etc., that the time frames that they're operating on are really quite long ones, and they're cultivating agents decades before they're put to use. Now, of course, with the Kennedy assassination, that happened in '63, so it might not have been so many years since Chomsky had been recruited at that point. But is the general idea that Chomsky establishes his credibility by being a very powerful critic of American empire, and then is in position there in order to defend the most egregious outrages on the part of that empire?
Well, I'm very, very sorry to say that's the way I see it. I mean, there are various kinds of agents, and they perform different roles, and they're put into different positions, and sometimes they're very deep. They're moles, and they just seem to be performing a regular job. I'm thinking especially in the media, which is my specialty has been for a long time, media criticism. And I've been in the media myself all my life. Since the age of 16, I've been in nothing but journalism and communications my whole life. As a reporter, an editor, an owner of magazines, publisher, radio, TV producer, on and on and on. And I've been aware for a long time of the importance of agents of the state, and it goes even back, fortunately or unfortunately, to my own family, where the Mounties in Canada tried to put my father out of his job by spreading lies about him. And so that was, in a way, I say fortunately or unfortunately, it sort of inoculated me early against the idea that you can completely trust your police forces. And that was a valuable lesson. And so I think that with Chomsky, for instance, it's the larger picture is bait and switch, and it's the pattern of the con man. I mean, in order for us to be conned, to turn over money for some stock that we're told is going to bring huge returns or whatever it may be, the person who gets us to part with our money first earns our trust somehow, and that's the con game. And the con men are really, really good at it, right? Even when they're petty criminals, and so I was conned one time for money, so that was another valuable experience. Then they become, and in the case of a Chomsky, he becomes the bait. And so a whole lot of people buy the bait. I mean, it's like we're all fish swimming along, and we bite on the bait, and it tastes good, and it's agreeable, and this is our kind of bait. And then the person does the switch and tells us something that ain't true. And we tend to believe it because we already swallowed all that bait from that person. So, this in turn, and this will, I think, this is sort of a pre-echo for what we may discuss about 9/11 Blogger.
Yes.
That when the disinformation then is disseminated cleverly by the bait and switch operators, then it becomes a matter of cleavage within the community, of the progressive community we're talking about. And then that becomes divide and conquer. So typically you get bait and switch followed by divide and conquer. And it's an old story. I mean, this has been going on for centuries. I'm not diminishing the importance of it today, but it's not new.
Now, in the left gatekeeping issue, more broadly, Chomsky is, just as you mentioned, just one example of well-known, and we're sort of keeping to North America here so far in the discussion, but well-known North American progressives, in addition to Chomsky, Alexander Cockburn, and others, many others, Amy Goodman, etc. They all are basically doing the exact same thing. So does that mean to you that we should have the same level of suspicion of all of them?
Well, I'm afraid so. I even, in my book, which I have here, I'm sort of leafing through it because that chapter, because I did go ahead and use the names of others, and I knew it wasn't a full list, who meet, the same sad criteria that Chomsky does. And David Barsamian, for instance, is one. Amy Goodman is another. As you say, Alexander Cockburn is one. And I've never sat down, actually, to make a list of them. I don't know, it'd be sort of a sad exercise, wouldn't it? But Gwynne Dyer, for instance, is one. Gwynne Dyer, who again, a person I have great respect for otherwise, and who said that we know who they are, they've got their brains squirting out of their eyes, really terrible, terrible stuff like that. And so, and again, they all meet those earlier criteria that I mentioned, Todd, that they are demonstrably progressive or left-wing, they're demonstrably intelligent, they're demonstrably well-informed, they demonstrably have had access to the same information that you and I and so many others have had because they refer to it. That's the proof they have access to that information, whether it's in books, say, by David Ray Griffin, or whether it's on the internet or wherever. And so they all have to be suspect. I'm sorry. And I believe that most people have no idea of the extent of subversion in our society of all sorts of institutions, certainly government, and also the corporate sector, and not least the media. And then on the left, the public intellectuals. They're in academia too. This is why academia has such a sad record when it comes to truth. Of all the places that should have a record for truth, it would be academia, and academics should not shrink from controversy. That should be their meat. They should welcome controversy. And yet, when you look at the whole output of academia on let us say 9/11, which is arguably one of the most, if not the most, pivotal events of our time, and still heavily affecting so much in our world today, and yet they show almost no curiosity, let alone intellectual courage in looking at it, assessing it, and publishing about it. So, I mean, we are looking at a very widespread situation of de facto censorship, and a lot of agentry would be involved in that.
Yeah. and as you say, 9/11 is the pretext for the wars, and so these intellectuals, these progressive leaders that we've been discussing, they're also the de facto leaders of the anti-war movement, I would say. Mm-hmm. And so this maybe is penetrating into why there is this persistent refusal on the part of the mainstream anti-war movement in North America to have a look at 9/11 truth. In other words, it's not based on an appraisal of the evidence. It's an imposed gatekeeping operation by these same people who have convinced their followers that they mustn't look at the information about 9/11, that mustn't take it seriously. Would you say that we're beginning to explain this gulf, this persistent gulf in the anti-war movement between the 9/11 truth anti-war activists and the other ones?
Yeah, I had an interesting experience. Was more than a year ago, back in January of 2010, when I attended an anti-war conference put on by New England United, and that was followed by a one-day meeting of the 9/11 Boston Truth Alliance. The Boston 9/11 Truth Alliance, and then I wrote an article about those two meetings, the one on the Saturday, the next on the Sunday, for the March 2010 edition of the Rock Creek Free Press, and that really caused a big ruckus because it was headed the peace movement versus the 9/11 truth movement, but I tried to point out in the article that which is by and large well received. I tried to point out in the article that, in fact, everyone should be for truth. I mean, no matter that that's a vague generalization, it's a high abstraction, the truth. Really, we should be normally talking in the plural about truths, but there shouldn't be any split about the pursuit of truth among people who claim they're in an anti-war movement or are in an anti-war movement or peace movement, and those who are seeking truth really in any area, whether it's corporate or whether it's political or geopolitical. So it's a false dichotomy that the truthers are opposed to peace, for instance, that they're only interested in truth. Actually, to be interested in truth, I would put it this way. You cannot have peace without justice, and you cannot have justice without truth. So it comes down to truth being the primary principle that we have to follow. And the justice and peace follow that. And so if you're not dedicated to truth, or even worse, if you're dedicated to obscuring the truth, or censoring the truth, or demonizing the truth, you are a bad dude, you know. But that's the situation. So an interesting thing is that I'm not seeing now so much division within what tends to be called the anti-war movement in the States and tends to be called the peace movement here in Canada. And I'm seeing a lot of people in the peace movement in Canada are truthers. In fact, there's virtually no split now. And but in the States, it's more obvious. And I had quite a back and forth with one of the leaders of the New England United anti-war movement. And finally, and it was civil, you know, it was energetic, but it was civil. And so it came down to me, because he had written something like 18 reasons why I shouldn't be believed. And so I wrote him back 18 questions. And then he emailed me back and he said, well, that's a lot of questions, you know, and it's going to take me some time to deal with them. And I said, no rush. And so then I didn't hear from him. So then I emailed him again and I said, look, I've just got like a couple of questions for you. And they're fairly simple ones about 9/11, which he refused to deal with. Just a simple question like, do you believe that there could have been any U.S. government involvement in 9/11? And you know what? He never did reply to this day. So I shouldn't have let it drop, but I wasn't going to bug the guy.
Yeah.
But I mean, I didn't mean to push him up against a wall or put him in a corner, but he put himself in a corner. He would not deal with 9/11 truth.
Well, we've got a serious gatekeeping problem within the 9/11 truth movement itself. It's not just a matter of people never having looked and refusing to look on, on the recommendation of people they admire. But within the 9/11 Truth Movement, we have some people who it would appear events of the last couple of years indicate that there are people who are in the movement and have credibility in the movement, but who are objectively acting as if they were agents of disinformation. And I'm thinking here about primarily now this, the recent history at this site, 911blogger.com. It's quite complex, and of course it's not easy to talk about without inviting calumny upon our heads, but you and I are both ready to talk about it today, and I'm grateful to you for this, Barrie. You yourself have been the recipient of some of this gatekeeping at 911blogger.com. Despite the high professional level of your work, the early start that you got going, and the high level of all of your work, when you attempted to post a blog post at 911blogger.com last year, a blog post that expressed your favorable appraisal of the research of a group of researchers called the Citizens Investigation Team, CIT, who've done research into what happened at the Pentagon. The main thing they've done is interview eyewitnesses to the events of the morning, and have come up with their own distinctive findings and interpretation, and have tried to spread this information as widely as possible. From very early on, 911blogger.com, the moderators at the site and some of the established and prominent participants at the site were outspoken critics of CIT, and over time an operation was launched at 911blogger.com, pointed very directly at CIT. Articles were posted claiming to be complete debunkings of the work of CIT, and then, of course, these generated long, contentious threads. And all of this that I'm describing is similar to the recent event at Blogger with an article posted by one of the moderators there that took to task David Ray Griffin's work on cell phone calls. And one of the things I'm interested in bringing out today is the similarity in the treatment of the two different cases, the CIT case and the Griffin case. Maybe we can get into that in more detail. In any case, this resulted in the Blogger moderators banning the CIT investigators from the site and many of their supporters who had defended them in these contentious threads, so that upwards of 30 people apparently have been, just CIT supporters have been banned. And you had the nerve to try to post your own favorable appraisal. And why don't you take it from here? I've introduced it rather long-windedly, so why don't you take over here?
Well, you know what? You didn't do it long-windedly. You took you described it very, very well. I think your setup of the issue is very good. I agree with the way you've put it, and that's the way I see it too. Now, I posted. Some people say that I posted my YouTube endorsation of not only CIT's evidence, but I endorsed, and I do still completely endorse, their integrity. I endorse their approach. Some of their members of CIT have made mistakes. There's one in particular has been intemperate sometimes in reacting to the people who are tormenting them. It's pretty understandable from a human emotional point of view, but we should try to avoid name calling in return to when we're being called names.
Right.
But, so they're not perfect. They're human. But anyway, I posted it, and some people say it didn't go up. But it did. It was up for 30 seconds. My YouTube was on Blogger for 30 seconds. Now, what this indicates to me is very much a hands-on censorship operation. I mean, just somebody just saw that, said, out, pull that switch. And that means, I think it's hands-on. I see 9/11 Blogger as being a false flag operation now. And regrettably, I have to assume that it's sort of like the website version of Noam Chomsky. From the time it was set up, it was a false flag operation. In other words, it wasn't legitimate. I would say it was set up, and I still have it. I have two computers, and I still have 9/11 Blogger as my homepage on one of them. And there's still a lot of really valuable information there. But remember what I said about bait and switch. And so the CIA itself says with propaganda that to be effective, it has to be 90% true. And then the 10% is sold on the basis 90% is true. They have gray, white, and black propaganda. You mix them. So anyway, I think that 9/11 Blogger was a honeypot. It remains a honeypot. It's obviously the premier 9/11 truth site in the world, as far as I know. And look at the people who would log on. And so they would harvest all the information about everybody logging on. Because there's a vast surveillance operation, run by the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, the whole batch of them, working, as the Washington Post says, out of 10,000 locations. 856,000 of them. They've got time on their hands. And so, but then the interesting thing is that when the authentic citizen researchers of the Citizen Investigation Team came along and actually went to the trouble of going to Washington, Arlington, and so on, and interviewing people. If you go to the National Security Alert, which is their site and the name of their DVD, you'll see these witnesses, and I would defy anyone to watch, say, that 1-hour DVD or go on the site and watch the witnesses. They've gone back and found more and more witnesses who are policemen, they're housewives, they're just regular people, and they all say, essentially, they saw the same thing. And I would just digress here for a moment away from what I agree is the most important issue here, which is false flag operations within our movement. I believe that is the most important issue here. However, the issue is usually put, what happened at the Pentagon? So the CIT people enable us, along with other evidence, which to me is incontrovertible, to answer that question. We can answer that question definitively in general. We can't answer about every particular. Remember, I mentioned truths with plural, with an S on it, not just truth. But what happened at the Pentagon is now known. It is known that no large jet aircraft impacted the Pentagon. There's abundant evidence for that. First of all, the hole in the facade of the Pentagon is entirely the wrong size and shape to match the silhouette of a 757 going into that building. It's just open and shut, and all sorts of arguments about all sorts of alleged details and so on, tertiary, secondary, subsidiary, peripheral discussions and arguments about facts and alleged facts, all pale in comparison to that central fact: the hole isn't right for a large airliner to have gone in. And then you can add on to that all sorts of other evidences, not enough debris, and so forth. And I've been looking into, because I've had a lifelong interest in aviation, other air crashes of a similar type. And boy, does it not qualify as a place where a large plane hit. But anyway, the second thing is that CIT witnesses show that there was a large jet aircraft in the area, and it was flying to the north of the fabled Sitgo station, not to the south as the official flight path would have it. And it passed very low over the naval annex and went toward the Pentagon. And what happened was it flew over the Pentagon. Now, this is, again, something that presumably is controversial for some people, and I'm not trying to push anything down anyone's throat here, absolutely not. I do, though, say that no one should arrive at a conclusion before they've gone to the National Security Alert site and examine the evidence there. And the reason that I say it was a flyover is because this plane existed and it headed toward the Pentagon. Some people say it hit the Pentagon, but they could and probably were mistaken, because there was a large explosion set off in the Pentagon just as that plane flew over it. Why did it fly over it? Well, first of all, that larger plane could not turn sharply to the left as it was heading toward the Pentagon, and there's no evidence or witness ever brought forward by anybody that said they saw such a large plane turning left. Also, such a large plane was never seen, and there's no evidence that it turned sharply right, even if physically it could. Thirdly, it couldn't sharply rise up straight into the air, and no one saw any such thing. Fourthly, it did not plow into the ground. There's no evidence of that. We also know it did not hit the Pentagon, because no such plane hit the Pentagon. And the sixth thing it could not have done is dematerialize, because matter cannot be made or destroyed. Therefore, it had to fly over. And the explosion was timed just as it flew over, the perfect illusion. That's the way they do these things. So this is, to me, all settled, and in its main structure, it was a magic illusion. So the people who keep insisting that Flight 77 went into the Pentagon are all suspect to me. Not all suspect, but most of them are, all the ones who are well informed and so on. Now, see, some of these are people who have done yeoman work on the World Trade Center. They're people who, and I'm going to diverge from mentioning names at this point.
That's good.
Yeah, well, it's not because I'm chicken shit, and I'm not weaseling out.
I can
it's
tell.
just that this is not an appropriate place to name, for me to name names. But the thing is that if you look at people who insist that a large airliner hit the Pentagon, they identify themselves. You just have to look them up and see who holds to that, and what are their other credentials and so on. Now, some of them have credentials, having done excellent work regarding the Twin Towers and or Building 7. So now, again, what are you looking at? You're looking at bait and switch and divide and conquer. That's what you're looking at. That's the pattern again.
Now, Barrie, let me ask you one question here. Many of these people who are severe critics of CIT and write long articles claiming that their articles debunk CIT. For example, they'll talk about CIT's interviews as being, not the proper way to interview people. Now, you're a professional journalist who's made your career out of interviewing people. What's your opinion of the CIT interview method? Do they make errors in their approach to people? Do they ask leading questions? You've looked at the evidence there, and you're really backing their work. So, what's your professional appraisal of their interviewing? Yeah, well, this is really stuff you can really get your teeth into. I mean, I taught journalism for 7 years, and part-time as part of my journalism and communications career, and interview techniques was one of the, and so there are many kinds of interviews. I mean, it's a fascinating area, and we all know, we've watched interviews where the interviewer is so softball, just goes along and so on, and then others where the interviewer is hard-nosed as hell and just provocative and breaking in and all that. There's so many ways of interviewing, and so when you look at the CIT interview technique, to me, it is completely brilliant. It is completely authentic, and it is believable, and it results in credible eyewitness testimony. They are pretty careful to not prompt people. They not only don't prompt people saying, well, you saw this, didn't you? That's prompting. They say, what did you see? And then when the people say, well, I saw this, I saw the plane, it was to the north of the Sitco station. Then they say, well, are you sure? They give them an out. They say, yes, I'm sure. Well, why are you sure? Well, because I saw it right over there.
you know. Well, then they say, could it have been to the south of the station? They say, no, it couldn't. Are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. How sure are you? I'm 100% sure. And these are police officers and so on. I mean, the eyewitness testimony is extremely credible that CIT has come up with. Now, probably the worst criticism of CIT comes from, and I'm really tempted to name his name, one of the blogger people, and he's a very nice guy. I've met him personally and everything. But the best he can say about, well, first of all, he said in a conference of 9/11 Truth Leaders a couple of months ago, he just said the work of CIT is, quote, this is my quote, completely without merit. He actually said that, and there were a whole lot of 9/11 Truth Leaders on the line. And then I challenged him kind of nicely about that, and then he said, well, what it is, it's subjective testimony about subjective subjects. That's almost his exact words. And that's so wrong. That's so wrong. I mean, first of all, of course, everything is subjective in the very final analysis. Everything. There's no such thing as objectivity. It has never been an objective painting painted or an objective sculpture sculpted. There's never been an objective news story written. I mean, just selection alone guarantees that. So everything is subjective in that in the ultimate philosophical sense. But then there are all sorts of gradations, and we know that various things almost certainly are true, and we can't live for millennia to find out. We just know that certain things hold together and are credible. By the way, one of the things that's said is that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. That's a phrase you'll hear, and actually that's quite incorrect. Anybody who's every day in courtrooms around the world, eyewitness testimony is sought and given. And it varies hugely. Some of the eyewitness testimony is people lying through their teeth. They'll even be charged with contempt of court. And other of this eyewitness testimony is found to be extremely credible. And eyewitness testimony is considered extremely important in a great number of court cases. And sometimes a whole case will just pivot on the testimony of one highly credible eyewitness. And I'm satisfied myself that if ever just what happened at the Pentagon got into an uncorrupted, fair court of law, that the eyewitness testimony of CIT would absolutely carry the day. But, I mean, are we ever going to see that? That's another question.
Now, Barrie, what do you think is the purpose behind the attacks, the vilification of CIT that's been launched so powerfully and consistently, and so extremely with the banning of so many, and the creation of an unspeakable subject? What is the purpose at 9/11 Blogger in selecting CIT specifically? What is it about the Pentagon that is so frightening and must be squelched when the critique of the demolitions at the WTC can go ahead unfettered?
Yeah, well, again, I think it fits into the larger pattern of cover-up. When what I call the diaboligarchy plans these things, they have immense resources of all kinds, from Hollywood scriptwriters to set up the original compelling narrative, right through to very, very complex cover-up activities in the media and elsewhere, in quasi-governmental bodies like NIST and so forth. For them to burn, I mean, I think that's the phrase, for them to burn 9/11 Blogger shows, and when I say them, I mean handlers, within the Pentagon, the CIA, within that security complex, among the 856,000 of them working out of the 10,000 locations, and some of them have a lot to say, and obviously they've sent down orders for 9/11 Blogger to be burned. Or in the words of spy novelist John le Carre in his first most famous novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, they've sent 9/11 Blogger out into the cold, as it were, because it's now outed. They have outed it, which is one of the worst things you can do with an agent, is to out him or her. Remember Valerie Plum. So that's what you're not supposed to do. But so for them to burn with their honeypot shows that the people behind the scenes are very, very concerned. Now, you're asking a hell of a question there, Todd. Why? And well, one thing is that they will make a valiant effort, and I think they won't succeed. I don't think they're succeeding in splitting the movement. I don't think there is a crisis in the movement.
No, I don't either.
I don't think so. But anyway, but they'll attempt to split the movement, and by pitting 9/11 truthers who have established bona fides regarding what happened in New York against other truthers who have equal bona fides about what happened at the Pentagon. So it's just a cleavage attempt. But the other thing is, you'll remember that Donald Rumsfeld, then the Defense Secretary, the day before 9/11, made this remarkable statement that the Pentagon, quote, couldn't account for $2.3 trillion, unquote. And that's on the record. Now, so why did he say that? As it were, why did he admit to that? And why did he say it publicly? Well, of course, as far as the timing of it is concerned, is brilliant news management. But anyway, I think that there's that sort of is an indicator that there are really dark secrets at the Pentagon. Now, the money guy at the Pentagon at the time was a guy named Dov Zakheim, a dual American-Israeli citizen. And it could be, and I'm just speculating here because God knows I don't have inside dope about the Pentagon. Sometimes you can look from the outside and read between the lines, as it were. But it could be that some of that $2.3 trillion was devoted to the planning of the 9/11 inside job terror fraud. Now, it wouldn't take trillions to do, but probably it was in the millions, perhaps the tens of millions. It was a very complex operation. They must have been working on it actively for about a year. And so it could be that somehow, in the worst-case scenario for the diaboligarchy, that there'd be the fingerprints of Israel on 9/11. And boy, they don't want that. A smoking gun with a Star of David on it would be very unwelcome in Tel Aviv or Washington.
Yeah. Well, Barrie, it seems that the operation actually has extended beyond CIT now. I think that I see these similarities in the methods with this recent critique of Griffin's work on phone calls. A post by a moderator, and then the vicious threads and the people being banned. And do you agree with me that there's similarity in the methods and that there could be some continuity in the policy there?
Yeah, well, they're going after, I don't know what you think, but I just had lunch yesterday with a tremendous truther who's there's no need to mention his name, but he's really thoughtful and on the ball, and he agreed that David Ray Griffin is sort of the gold standard for truthers, and the guy with the most credentials of authenticity, honesty, impeccable research, communication skills. David he's really tops in all those respects. And so criticism of him, at least harsh, nasty criticism, which he's had, like being called a slime bag, for instance, he hasn't had to suffer that in the past. So the fact, it's like burning 9/11 blogger. To attack David Ray Griffin in gutter terms shows really a desperation on the part of those who are saying this and those who are ordering them to say it. And so it is part of the same pattern, no question.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's also hitting a guy when he's down. Now, I'm not saying David Ray Griffin is very far down, but a lot of people listening to this will know, and I realize we're running out of time. We got 2 minutes.
Yeah, we've just got 1 minute left, that's all.
1 minute. So that David Ray Griffin had back surgery a few months ago, and it went really badly wrong, and they had to go in and again and do more back surgery, and then he already has a heart valve inserted, and then so he suffered a minor stroke, or perhaps a couple of minor strokes, suffering what's called aphasia. I don't think his I've been in touch with him, and I don't think that his faculties are very much diminished, but they may be diminished a little. So it's kind of hitting a guy when he's down too.
Yeah. Yeah, the timing was very interesting, and it's not the only. There have been other attacks on him since he came out of the hospital as well. Well, Barrie, I'm sorry we've run out of time, and we really could talk about this more, and perhaps we shall if we both have time. I want to thank you very much for coming on, and I really appreciate your perspective on these complexities, which are so difficult to sort out, and I really value having talked with you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tod, for a very good interview. I'm a sort of a connoisseur of them, and this was good.
Thanks so much.
On your side.
Okay, I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye now.